Okay, let's get started. My name is Mark Tokola. I'm with the Korea Economic Institute. We're very proud to have as a guest with us today, Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt. So welcome, Nick. Can you
Hey,
tell us where
thank
you
you.
are? It doesn't really matter so much where people are, but it's nice to know anyway somehow.
Yeah, I'm out in Lewis, Delaware. It's at the confluence of the Delaware Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. It's a small, slightly remote backwater, but it's quite a beautiful place with a lot of very nice, friendly, normal Americans.
Very nice. Sounds like not the worst place to be these days. Um, Let me tell the audience too, as we start, that we'll save some time at the end for questions and answers. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom platform. And you can go ahead and start putting in questions whenever you like. And we'll get to them at the last 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, a lot of ink or Zoom hours have been put into the topic of the post-pandemic world. One of the most thoughtful pieces that's come out was by Dr. Eberstadt in the mid-April National Bureau of Asian Research website. He had an article called Thoughts About the Shape of Things to Come in the Post-Pandemic World, which I thought was well worth discussing. And I'm eager to hear your current thinking about that. So Nick, in your mid-April piece, you were saying you thought the economic predictions were too optimistic. Do you still feel that way?
Well, I think that we've come to I think we've come to recognize the gravity and the severity of our economic crisis a little bit more broadly than people did at the time that I was writing. What I talked about was a sort of a fog of war phenomenon. We really were starting in March to recognize that something quite grave was developing all around the world, but we weren't able to think about this as being something new. We were kind of like using old metrics and old tools to think about a new world. And so for the first 6 weeks, at least, of the crisis, I'm thinking from maybe mid-March until late April, the economic prognosticators and forecasters on a week-by-week basis were way off, always way low on their forecasts, let's call them guesses. For example, for what the weekly jobless claims numbers would be. Now, I think there's been a learning curve, and now we're getting to a point where there is the first sign of, of response. We saw that in the jobless, in the monthly job reports numbers for May that were released last week. So I think maybe we're coming a little bit more to grips with this. But many people who are examining the economic implications of the crisis are now seeing that this is a very long-term phenomenon, and we're not going to be finished with this by by the end of the year. So I'd say that the more experience we have in this new world, the more people are coming to grips with it, as we'd expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure people know what to listen to or to look at to understand how the economy is doing. The stock market looks great. The unemployment numbers are better than expected for May.
Sure.
So is it GDP growth, or is it trade, or where do you look to know how you should feel about it?
Well, of course, if you look at the stock market, we haven't had a crisis at all at this point. The stock market is, at least I don't know how it's doing, in the middle of today, but as of yesterday, it was back to the levels that it had been registering at the beginning of 2020. This doesn't really look like the economy at the beginning of 2020 to me. The monthly job reports numbers from for May, which were released last week, showed more job creation than anybody at all thought. There was nobody who guessed that we'd see the sorts of numbers, which was to say, with quote, only 13.3% unemployment. And if you made the little correction for misclassification of people who said that they were they were employed, but they had no work and were getting no money. If you made the correction for that, it'd be 16.3%. Not great, kind of depression level, but certainly not as dire as was being suggested. Because the shock is so great, our tools are not calibrated to give us perfectly accurate, on-time, real-time information about how things are going on. So certainly one wants to look at what's happening with employment, because human beings are kind of the basis of our economy. One can look at all sorts of so-called high-frequency data, which are being generated on an almost continuous real-time basis to see what sorts of patterns there are in mobility for people around the country and the world, for as far as movement. You can see some indications in real time about spending in certain sectors, about travel, things like that. It's quite clear that economic activity is going to take a real hit for the first half of 2020. And then the question is, how quickly will it be able to bounce back? Part of what we haven't seen yet, in part because of the nature of the policy response, is any appreciable bankruptcy, foreclosure, eviction. And once we start to see those shoes drop, or whatever the right metaphor is, then I think maybe we'll have a little bit more of a sense of how consequential this is. But we've had an absolutely extraordinary policy response, which has cushioned and to some extent muffled or concealed the severity of the shock, with the enormous multi-trillion-dollar stimulus, with the Fed going into reaches and realms that it had never been in before. And I mean, and that's what I think policymakers are supposed to do in a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. But so, because of the limits of the data, because of the unusual nature of the crisis, because of the policy response, a lot has been sort of concealed. And as we see more of a fullness of time in the next couple of months and the next couple of quarters, I think we'll have a much better sense of where things go.
Okay, to take a little bit bigger and longer view about the long-term effects, Robin Niblett of Chatham House has been talking recently about a change in the global economy, going from what he calls a just-in-time economy to a just-in-case economy, where there'll be a reshoring of what we consider essential manufacturing, stockpiling of things we consider necessary. So can you see that happening, and what effect would that have on global productivity?
Sure. No, I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's a very important observation. And I tried to indicate something along similar lines in that piece to which you refer. I guess to go one step back, so much depends upon when and whether we have a reliable, effective, and readily accessible vaccine for COVID. I'm assuming that we will, and maybe even that we will sooner than some expect. But we do have to recognize that so far there are no vaccines for any coronaviruses. And I can't discount the possibility that it'll take a very long time to come up with something like that. So the nature of the contagion will condition, I think, a great deal. And if we can, so to speak, defeat the contagion, then I think the world will be on a rather different trajectory from if we have to live under its shadow for a longer period of time. In either case, the the whole shock, I think, has prompted a kind of a reconsideration of globalization. I don't think that, my own impression is that it's not going to burn globalization to the ground. It's not like World War I, which completely ended globalization 1.0 that had begun in, let's say after the Civil War and gone into the early 20th century, but it's conditioning it, as you were saying. There'll be much more of an interest in local sourcing of critical, essential parts of the value or supply chain. I think there's going to be less interest in international coordination. I think that's probably unfortunate, but that seems to be the way that things are heading. Economic nationalism, I think, is alive and well, and is we see it roaring all around us. All of this is going to have, I think, a still indeterminate impact on the architecture that we've built since the end of World War II for a globalized economy.
Yeah, I can see a lot of people arguing or lobbying about what an essential industry is.
Sure.
So what do you need as a nation? Are we just talking about steel production or autos or cultural or media or who knows what might be considered essential? That's very much in the eye of the beholder.
Well, of course, and it's also a mischievously political argument, and everybody can make their own special pleading case for their own special interest in this sort of circumstance. I think it'll probably be a little bit harder for umbrella manufacturers to make the case than, say, for pharmaceutical value chains. Probably IT is an area where people will invoke the national security question. And actually, a lot of this, I think, Mark, overlaps with the whole question of what the US and what the international community's approach to the People's Republic of China is going to be. My guess is that in the US and Europe and Japan and other parts of the international community, people might not be quite so worried if they were dependent upon a supply chain for IT that, let's say, leads through the Republic of India, as opposed to the People's Republic of China. Because we've seen in the most sort of indelible way, the bad actor problem that we've had with the CCP in the pandemic. I mean, a lot of government actors have not been terribly smart and have been, kind of slow-footed or worse. We can say that about our own country, but the actual storyline of what the CCP did and did not do during this disaster, I think is pretty horrifying and raises more general questions about where China controlled by the CCP should be in the entire international, global integrated economy and global governance situation.
Mm-hmm. But China seems to be maneuvering to try to take advantage of the crisis. They're contrasting quite publicly their success, I'm putting that in air quotes, in dealing with the pandemic compared to the US failure, as they put it. And they seem to be maneuvering themselves to try to look like they're going to be helpful with the coming low-income country debt crisis that's likely to hit. Mm-hmm. So is China maneuvering in a way that they'll come out of this stronger?
Well, there are a lot of people who think that China will come out stronger, that China is showing a successful model as to be contrasted with the faltering, failing US or more generally Western model. I'm kind of a skeptic of that for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, I don't think that anybody outside of the standing committee, and maybe not even there, knows the true prevalence and impact of COVID-19 in China. My AEI colleague, Derek Scissors, a month ago, did a little paper, which is basically back of the envelope, looking at what we know from other places and how this has worked. And he surmised that at that point, China really ought to have had something like 3 million infections outside of Hubei province. And we know that China's own figures are just, ridiculously false. By the same token, we seem to be presented with what we might call man-made statistics from China in regard to the economic consequence of the crisis so far. When I say man-made statistics, yes, they show a drop, but it looks almost as if it's the smallest drop that man-made statistics could show without triggering the laugh out loud response. I mean, things which are harder to lie about, like auto sales are down by 42%, the GDP was down by what, 6.8% or something. So we don't really know how bad it is yet, but I think we can be sure it's worse than we've been told. And the third thing is the government is making a very strong public showing, public face of their success and strength and cohesion. I have to guess that internally, the party is in the midst of an absolutely raging crisis. Because just look at the last year. They had a humiliating defeat by the democracy protests in Hong Kong on what they see as their home soil. I'm not a fan of trade wars, but in the U.S. in the U.S.-China trade dispute, China's vulnerability, I think, was revealed quite inescapably. Then you have this public relations, I mean, in addition to everything else, a public relations catastrophe for the Communist Party of China with their malfeasance in making a localized epidemic into a global pandemic. And now I think you have a much bigger economic problem in China than official statistics are recognizing. So we may see Oz the great and mighty, but I think if you get behind the curtain, it may look a little bit different there right now.
Okay. Also on the question of dealing with China, we've seen this conversation about expanding the G7. So it sounds like Korea's been invited to join the G7. I guess Russia has, but China has not been.
No.
I would think that makes it difficult for South Korea. I mean, it's a great honor to be invited. They've earned it. They probably should be part of the top table. But how does Korea join an expanded G7 like that while China doesn't? Doesn't that kind of make them choose a side?
Well, yes, I think it kind of does. And I think some would say that they've got a treaty that defends them, that puts them on a side already. I myself, if I were taking the Stanford Binet IQ test and I said, which of these does not look like the other, I'd kind of want to know what Vladimir Putin was doing at the table. But leaving that awkward inconsistency.
Well, I guess having been part of the old G8, inviting them back maybe.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I suppose you could make some sort of old club argument or something like that. But the argument for bringing in Australia and India and ROK, I think, is a very strong one, and it's not going to be linked entirely to the current coronavirus crisis. This is a whole question about dealing with a future world economy. I realize the current discussions in the ROK about balancing between Beijing and Washington, where that politics is going, but they're very positive opportunities, I think, for the ROK from this possible new configuration. We don't know if it's going to last beyond a single meeting. We don't know whether how the September meetings are going to go, but the concept, I think, is an intriguing one.
Mhm. Okay. Kind of taking the world structure as a whole, let's even zoom out further and look at this question about returning to an institutionalized world. There's a lot of talk about putting things back the way they were, but the way the world liberal order was conceived, it felt very institutional because the Atlantic world is so institutional. We've got NATO and the European Union and the OSCE. I mean, the G7 is 6 Atlantic countries plus
Right.
Japan. So that's how I tend to see the liberal
Right,
world order.
right.
But Asia is not that institutionalized.
No,
so
of course.
in your article, you talk about the locus of power shifting to Indo-Pacific for a generation or more to come. Does that mean the world will be less institutional as you go forward?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Mark. That's a very interesting question. And I guess we have to go back to World War II to try to grapple with it. So, I mean, to oversimplify, my own perspective would be that it was easier to have all of this deep multilateral enmeshment with the transatlantic community because the German question was solved. And so you could have the entente between France and Germany, which had been not just historical enemies, but a couple of catastrophes in living memory at the time that this entente began. And I mean, I guess I'm not a diplomat, so I don't have to be diplomatic. The Japanese question hasn't been solved. The Japanese question has not been answered. And the Japanese question is as central to certainly Northeast Asia and maybe to East Asian multilateralism as the German question is to Europe. And unless and until there is a confidence, I mean, let's speak frankly, unless and until there is a confidence in other open societies in the East Asian Pacific region about having Japan as a reliable, trusted, secure partner, it's going to be very hard to have anything like the sort of institutional framework that you're describing.
That leads me, I'll do one last question then kind of based on that, and we'll turn to the audience. So we've got questions coming in. So in your article, you talk about the fact that it's hard for us to see the post-pandemic world from where we are. And you compare it to trying to foresee the post-World War II era from 1939.
Yeah.
But it was during World War II, right in the middle of it, even when the outcome was uncertain, that they were laying the groundworks for the United Nations system and even for the European Economic Community. Those are being designed during the war.
Yeah.
So what should we be doing now to prepare for the post-pandemic world?
Well, your question again, I think, is central. And in asking that question, the first thing which I think comes to mind is what we don't have. And what we don't have is the national and international leadership to start attempting to visualize what a stable, prosperous, free, healthy, generally healthy, not just public health terms, generally healthy environment would be like. And it's going to be much more difficult to get to that sort of an objective if we're kind of groping and stumbling there kind of spontaneously. It would be really beneficial at this point if we had people, especially in leadership positions, who were thinking about this future. Unfortunately, I myself don't really see much of that yet. Maybe you see things that I haven't seen, but I wish we could see and hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation. Personally, what I'm seeing is a little bit of hope on the European front. The European Union is actually starting to pull themselves together on this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
There's much more of a common thinking between Germany and France now, and the European Central Bank on stimulus. So the idea that this is going to finish off the EU would kill it seems not to be the case. At least the EU seems to be emerging stronger. Let me turn to some questions that we have coming in.
Okay.
First, Laurie Krause asks, what accounts for the absence of inflation in our economy?
Well, I wish Professor Krauss were here and we could ask him that question. So, but in the absence of his being on screen in Zoom, I guess we'd have to say that there's an enormous amount of slack in the economy. I mean, this is the same. This is the same thing which we've been wondering about since the end of the financial crisis of 08, 09. Where's the inflation? Well, we haven't really seen the inflation, and I think an awful lot of that has to do with the gap, with the potential gap that we find ourselves in. And if one believes that that is the reason for the low low increases in price levels, or the decline in price levels now, possibly this could go on for quite a while. I've certainly read a lot of people speculating about that.
Yeah, I heard one commentator say that the idea of borrowing $1 trillion to pump into the economy and not raise interest rates shows a phenomenal strength of the economy fundamentally.
Yeah.
Let's see, Robert Gay is asking, how much will China's debt to GDP adversely affect its Belt and Road Initiative and other programs it's trying to achieve?
Yeah, well, very good question. I mean, we've, again, and this is hardly my area of expertise. I look to people like Derek Scissors, whom I mentioned earlier, my colleague at AEI, but there are others as well, who have pointed out that China's net new investment abroad has been declining for the last number of years, and that China's debt to GDP has been obviously rising, and it's underreported in the conventional accounts. There's been a lot more talk than action in BRI, and I would presume we're going to see more of the same, especially if it turns out that China's economy has been jolted more by this shock than the official Beijing statistics are currently reporting.
You know, I think one of the untold stories is how much money Japan is putting into infrastructure around the Asian region too. People
Yes.
talk about BRI, but Japanese
Yes.
infrastructure investment's huge.
Yes, absolutely so.
Let's see, Terrence Matsuo asks, what criteria should be used by Korea to determine where travel bubble should be created?
Yes. A travel
bubble, the idea that you could have a few countries set aside, and within that group you could travel.
Oh, yes.
So a trusting group of countries.
Yes. Well, there's going to be a big, I think there's going to be a big need for the ROK and for other small trading economies who to buffer themselves against the shocks that we see coming. And the trade shocks may not just occur in 2020 with debt crises in different parts of the world and other possible lockdowns if we don't have a credible vaccine that's universal. This economic crisis could potentially continue for quite a while, and so proactive measures to deepen economic integration with trusted partners, I think could be beneficial. It could be very beneficial. Again, this is one of these things that's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of coordination. And just as looking at the world in 1939, leadership was in a little bit of scarce supply then, and it looks to me the same way now. It's an imperfect analogy, but the shortage of leadership, I think, is the same in both circumstances.
Yeah. Time's running out a little bit. I'm going to take one more question from Mark Mannion, who asks, Have you thought about the intersection of the COVID-19 economy and demographics? For example, some regions of Southeast Asia and Africa are reaping a demographic dividend from younger populations entering the workforce. So does the new economy alter that trajectory?
Well, the COVID crisis, I think, creates a lot of potentially serious problems for emerging economies simply because of the economic shocks that they may experience, the externally induced economic shocks, which they will perhaps experience. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of sub-Saharan Africa, where the drop in export revenues from commodities and revenues from remittances could have really quite dire effects, especially in societies where public health infrastructures are not that developed, and where government response capacities are not that developed. It is true that younger populations may be inherently less susceptible to the contagion and to the mortality from the contagion. This is a rather unusual virus, the coronavirus. But that does not mean that those societies are not susceptible to devastating coronavirus-induced shocks.
On the demographic front, I think it's Leslie Vinjamuri from Chatham House. I don't want to misquote her, but she was talking about the generational effect of the pandemic, that the rising generation is going to be given a lot of responsibility to fix this problem, but they're also being told that they're going to be having a tough time finding work. They're going to pay some consequences from it. And they're a generation who's not going to learn the world by traveling around for 20 years. They're a generation who might learn it visually. So we may be looking at a different mindset for the next generation coming along.
Yeah, no, what are they being called now? The unluckiest generation?
I hadn't heard that, but
I've seen that formulation coined somewhere. But it's the young people who were just getting in the job market when the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 struck, and who now are a decade older, forming, ordinarily at least, forming families, setting down roots, establishing themselves. It's been a pretty rough haul for that particular demographic cohort. And more generally speaking, I think we see, at least in the United States, some disturbing signs about the slow pace of net worth, of wealth formation for younger cohorts in the United States. This is pre-COVID. This had to do, I think, with the sort of the problems in our problems of what some would call inclusion, economic inclusion, prosperity for all with our economy. And those have clearly been sharpened, maybe even viciously sharpened over the last number of months. And I don't see anybody talking about what a formula for prosperity for all would look like for the United States. Whatever happens in 2020, we're going to need some serious and credible discussion about how we get an economy that can make prosperity for all of its people.
Yeah, big questions coming up. I'm afraid our time is up. Matter of fact, we're a little bit over time now. I feel like we've had the first half of the conversation, so we could have got a lot longer. So I hope you'll be able to come back and join us again soon.
It was a pleasure, and those wonderful questions and wonderful discussions. I'll look forward to round 2.
Okay, we'll play that since we can. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.